military man, was also starting to speak out publicly on the pernicious Jewish influence. General George Moseley saw the Jewish pressure building for global war, and in a speech in Philadelphia said, "The war now proposed is for the purpose of establishing Jewish hegemony throughout the world." He would later testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee on June 1st, arguing that Jews in America were allied to a global Jewish state and should be banned from public office and denied the right to vote. He identified organizations like the American Jewish Committee, the American Jewish Congress, the Jewish Labor Committee, and B'nai B'rith as pushing for war on behalf of world Jewry. He said, quote, "The Jews must bring themselves to the realization that the 120 million people composing the American nation are not going to be run by Jews in whole or in part." Moseley's statement was, of course, stricken from the record. Another testimony came in mid-1939 by Joseph Kennedy, yes, the Kennedy. At the time, he was the American ambassador to Great Britain. Kennedy expressed his concerns to his colleagues in London about the Jewish role in pushing America toward war. He said, quote, "Jews are running the United States, and the democratic policy of the United States is a Jewish production." A month later, the British ambassador to Germany, Neville Henderson, confirmed that the hostile attitude in Great Britain was the work of Jews. Here again we see a parallel action by Jews on both sides of the Atlantic. This would be consistent with Baruch's role as a prominent confidant of both Roosevelt and Churchill. So here we have some of the most prominent American officials warning each other about the Jewish push for war. The Jewish-owned media was also becoming even more active by this time. Most of the daily newspapers pushed for American entrance into the war. These included the New York Times, the New York Herald Tribune, the Chicago Daily News, and Time magazine, all owned by Jews. The Jewish motion picture industry also did its part to get America into war. Early efforts like Beasts of Berlin came out in 1939 and set the stage for a flood of Jewish-approved films over the next 3 years. In 1940, the Jews in Hollywood released graphic and high-impact films like Escape and Mortal Storm. In May, two major Jewish studio heads, Jack and Harry Warner, whose real names were Itzhak and Hirsch Wonskalaza, actually wrote to Roosevelt, assuring him that they would, quote, "do all in our power within the motion picture industry to show the American people the worthiness of the cause for which the free peoples of Europe are making such tremendous sacrifices." Let that sink in. Two enormously powerful and influential Jews in Hollywood were in direct correspondence with the sitting president in America, letting the president know that they would use their films to promote war. By 1941, more Jewish filmmakers and producers were working pro-war themes into their films. It became so noticeable that the anti-war movement at the time, which was called America First, warned that this belligerent Jewish propaganda was becoming widespread and was loading lies into their films to cause Americans to want war. In August of the same year, 4 months before Pearl Harbor, Senator Gerald Nye also warned about this Jewish war propaganda in Hollywood, arguing that these film studios had become the most gigantic engines of propaganda in existence to rouse the war fever in America and plunge this nation to her destruction. By that time, nearly 3 dozen major pro-war films had already been released. In the end, more than 60 explicitly pro-war films were produced, along with dozens of ordinary films that incorporated subtle pro-war messages by Jews in Hollywood. The Jewish propaganda pushing Americans toward war caught the attention of Charles Lindbergh, who said, "The greatest danger Jews pose to this country lies in their large ownership and influence in our motion pictures, our press, our radio, and our government." By March of 1941, it was the Jewish lobby that pressured Congress to pass the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed America to send armaments and military supplies to Britain and other nations. Thus, on all fronts, it was powerful and influential Jews driving peaceful Americans toward war in order to destroy the hated German regime. Hated simply because Germans sought to have their own nation free of Jewish influence. There is no doubt that Lindbergh was right, that British Jews were pushing the US toward war and that they were succeeding. A profound admission came from the leading British Zionist, Chaim Weizmann, delivered via letter to Churchill. Quoting his letter at length here, "There is only one big ethnic group in America which is willing to stand to a man for Great Britain and a policy of all-out aid for her, the 5 million Jews. From Secretary Morgenthau, Governor Lehman, Justice Frankfurter, down to the simplest Jewish workman or trader, they are conscious of all that this struggle against Germany implies. It has been repeatedly acknowledged by British statesmen that it was the Jews who, in the last World War, effectively helped to tip the scales in America in favor of Great Britain. They are keen to do it, and may do it again." So here we have the most explicit admission by a Jew himself. American Jews, in conjunction with British Jews, hold the key to war. They are keen to do it. Virtually upon command, they can tip the scales again and drive Americans into another war that Americans themselves desperately wish to avoid. And not just the most powerful and influential Jews, but even the average Jews, all did their part as a collective Jewish whole, 5 million Jews strong, to plunge America into war, whether Americans wanted it or not. Despite all of the Jewish war propaganda, the American public still opposed war by about 80%, a clear majority. Roosevelt's Jews were increasingly desperate. At that point, only a direct attack on American soil could alter public opinion. Roosevelt had been harassing the Germans for 2 years, but Germans refused to bite. What to do? There is evidence that the Pearl Harbor attack was effectively a false flag event.